Tired of big tech clashing with your Catholic values? Fide Chat is now live on the Apple App Store and Google Play Store. It's private, encrypted, and built by Catholics for Catholics, with features like parental controls and more. Connect securely with family, friends, and groups. Download Fide Chat at fide.email. Technology without compromise.
So we have a couple of bits of news we'll start with before we go to our main story. And I'm going to start with the Catholic news because this is a Catholic news channel primarily. We'll start here going to Info Catholica. There was some consecrated hosts were stolen out of a tabernacle in a parish a few days ago. And today there will be an act of reparation done for it. So you may consider in your charity to do to unite some prayers, maybe your rosary, or if you're going to go to mass today for whatever reason, it being a first Saturday, by the way, which is a good day to do reparation since it's the 5 First Saturdays devotion. You can unite your acts of reparation at that mass with this as well. The headline here is Monsignor Argeo will preside over the act of reparation for the theft of consecrated hosts at La Santa Espina. We know that they went directly to the tabernacle, forced it open with a lever, and took the Blessed Sacrament, the Ciboria, with the body of Christ. They didn't steal anything of material value, maybe the Ciboria, but so this wasn't a typical, breaking and entering situation. They went for the hosts. That's going to narrow down the kinds of people who did this dramatically. The act of desecration happened on Sunday, December 28th. He will preside over a reparation today, January 3rd at 6 p.m. local time in the desecrated church located approximately 40 kilometers from the city of Valladolid. So they think it's done out of economic motive here. I'm sorry, if you're breaking in and stealing consecrated hosts, that's probably not economic motive. So I'm going to disagree just in principle, because what economic motive do you have for breaking into a church and stealing the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, truly present in the most blessed sacrament of the altar? Unless you're going to sell them to devil worshippers or something. But anyway, that's the Catholic news. Now, the other news, I woke up to this. I don't even usually get online when I first get up in the morning. But you may have heard that the U.S. military conducted airstrikes, softening up the anti-air systems of Venezuela before doing a helicopter raid on Caracas, where U.S. Special Forces, along with U.S. law enforcement, captured Nicolas Maduro. Done and done. He is now in U.S. custody. So today's going to be an interesting day. There will be more news on this when the President of the United States goes live from Mar-a-Lago at 11 a.m. Central Time, or 11 a.m. Eastern Time, rather. So that'll be 10 a.m. Central where I'm at and 9 a.m. Pacific, mostly for you Americans watching. Personally, I won't shed a tear over Nicolas Maduro, one of the men who most directly responsible for essentially doing a reign of absolute darkness over that country and being in cahoots with some of the most evil organizations on the planet. Not a tear will be shed for him. And you should thank God that this happened as smoothly as it did, though also I would suggest saying a prayer for those who were caught in the crossfire, because people always are. I wouldn't rejoice necessarily in this, but I also wouldn't just be immediately against what happened. Maduro was an absolute monster. Not going to shed a tear for him. More news as it develops, though. Go ahead and watch that today. This is going to be the dominant news story everywhere for the weekend. And it will overshadow the story I'm going to tell you today. I covered this in very brief a couple of days ago in passing, but I knew there was going to be more, and now we have it. Pope Leo has dismissed the Papal Master of Ceremonies, who had been a staunch defender of the traditional Latin Mass. And he did so because a hot mic allegedly caught him saying a slur usually thrown at James Martin types. That word that means you take some sticks and you tie them together. That word rhymes with the word maggot. That word. Can't use it on YouTube. They will destroy my channel if I do. So the story took an interesting twist because there has been some investigation into who was responsible, and it turned out to be a Catholic blogger, a progressive Catholic blogger whose website I have used for news sources before. So we go here to the initial story from Info Vaticana, sort of a Spanish equivalent to a kind of a life site news kind of operation, and treated with the same disdain by the James Martin types in the church. In fact, on the day of the conclave, or the day before we got Pope Leo XIV, one of their reporters saw Austin Ivere and James Martin sharing very much like schoolyard girl style giggles together, because they had they apparently knew how the conclave was going to go. And their reporter started talking to them. And as soon as he identified who he was, they clammed up. This website is very known more in Europe than in the US. The headline here is Leo XIV dismisses his master of ceremonies, most sympathetic to the traditional Latin Mass, for a comment made on an open microphone. Now, the comment might have been insensitive, maybe some crude use of language, if it's even true, but his use of that word does, lean into the truth, we'll say. There are a great number of people of that type in the Roman Curia. They seem to be close to the Pope, and we're close to the last one. They seem to be in control or influencing the levers of power. So again, him using that kind of language, interesting that the Pope would dismiss him for it. But here we go for the initial part of the story, and then it gets weird. A comment picked up by an open microphone, barely audible, without verifiable context, and without any objective possibility of identifying its intended recipients, has been enough to trigger a swift backlash against Monsignor Marco Agostini, one of the papal masters of ceremonies, and to this day, one of the figures most clearly identified with the defense of the traditional liturgy within the Vatican. The phrase, translated to English as all the redacted together, appears fleetingly in an off-the-record comment from a Vatican News institutional video of the Pope's Christmas meeting with cardinals and bishops residing in Rome. Let's pause here. I'm going to go out on a limb and say all the James Martin types together word was said when in context of a meeting with all the cardinals and bishops residing in Rome. Far be it from me to read too much into something, but he might have been commenting on at least a faction of the bishops and cardinals there, if not the whole body. We have estimates from sources who would know such things that up to 80% of the bishops in the church are of that persuasion, which is shocking, but not that shocking when you think about it too much. He continues saying nothing in the audio allows one to determine with certainty who he was referring to, or even whether it was an expression directed at a specific isolated group or a private comment inadvertently recorded during a moment of organizational transition. The attribution of the comment to Agostini was first reported by Celere Non Possum, that's the news website in question. And from that moment on, the machinery was set in motion with a speed that was as revealing as it was unsettling. There has been no clear official explanation, no calm contextualization of the events, and no transparent investigation that would allow for an assessment of the true gravity of the incident. The mere existence of a blurry audio recording has been enough to justify a disproportionate and automatic reaction. Dismissing the papal master of ceremonies is a big deal. They did it for potentially catching him saying something that many would argue is altogether true about many of the bishops and cardinals. Now, Celere Non Possum is an interesting news outlet. They get a lot of scoops. That's why I use them. In that same way, though, that American Magazine gets scoops. American Magazine is very restrained in its reporting. But oftentimes, they will tell you the much harder truth than you might expect from them, because their intended audience is and are progressive types. It is the Jesuit newspaper in the United States. It is possibly the biggest Catholic publication in the U.S. and one of the biggest in the world as an extension. And Celere Non Possum appears to be kind of cut from the same cloth. Their intended audience are progressive, so they will say the quiet part out loud. Agostini is not a neutral name within the Vatican. He is known for his adherence to the traditional Latin Mass, for regularly celebrating Mass according to the ancient Roman rite in the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica, and for his presence in spheres unequivocally associated with classical liturgical Catholicism, including the traditional pilgrimage to Covadonga, In the current climate, this trajectory is not merely a personal trait. It is an uncomfortable ecclesial position for some. And when that profile becomes troublesome, any pretext will do. The problem isn't a phrase. The problem is who says it. The contrast becomes scandalous when one observes the Vatican's handling in recent years of infinitely more serious cases. The recent history of the Roman Curia is marked by documented episodes of high-ranking clergy involved in active, illicit conduct of the flesh, living double lives, using controlled substances, parties of a fleshly nature on Vatican premises, and even internal blackmail schemes based precisely on these behaviors. In many of these cases, the institutional response was slow, opaque, or simply non-existent. Discreet transfers, administrative silence, appeals for mercy, and pastoral care. No urgency, no immediate accountability, no open microphones used as grounds for summary execution. They're referring here to a party held several years ago by the now retired Cardinal Coco Palmero. It was a one where a lot of the little white powder, popular in the 80s as an illicit substance, was heavily present, and a lot of synodal encounters among James Martin types were happening. The police busted the door down, and that's how it became a news story. And no one was punished for it. No one of any importance, certainly not the cardinal who was there. But a comment caught on microphone, saying the truth, an uncomfortable truth, was enough. Now, we go here to also Info Vatican for a different article in their ongoing reporting on this. To give you an idea, kind of the gravity of this. Headline is, who is Marco Agostini, the master of ceremonies for 3 popes, dismissed in a lavender-scented fit? Sir Benedict, Francis, and now Leo, briefly. He was an Italian priest who spent his entire adult life in the service of the Church, first in his home diocese and for the last 16 years in the very heart of the Vatican. His name was hardly known outside liturgical and curial circles, but his presence was a regular one, albeit always discreet at major papal celebrations. He belonged to the Diocese of Verona. He was ordained a priest in 1992. From the beginning of his ministry, he showed a clear inclination toward liturgical service, a demanding and often overlooked field, yet essential to the life of the Church. His early years were spent in pastoral duties and diocesan assignments, in a relatively uneventful career marked by regularity and institutional fidelity. In other words, he never made waves. He did his job, and he did one that was actually kind of hard. Those who know him highlight his methodical, reserved, and profound clerical nature, far removed from the media spotlight. He was eventually called to Rome to join the Holy See structure. Before his appointment as Master of Ceremonies, he worked as an official in the Secretariat of State, specifically for the section for relations with states, a school of rigor, discretion, and institutional obedience. This experience solidified his reputation as a trusted priest, accustomed to quiet work and curial discipline. It also means he was not one to fly off the handle. He was also definitely not a what you would call radical traditionalist. Yes, he had good taste in liturgy and defended the Catholic Church's teachings on the liturgy and the traditional forms of the liturgy. It's probably why he was marked by that blog, as you'll see, to be removed. He was appointed in 2009 by Benedict to be Pontifical Master of Ceremonies, a position that would completely change the focus of his ministry. From that moment on, his life became tied to the Pope's calendar, solemn celebrations, canonizations, consistories, apostolic journeys, and events of maximum public exposure. And despite that, people didn't know who he was. He was pictured standing on the thumbnail of this video is a picture taken from when Pope Leo was introduced to the world, and standing next to him was Monsignor Agostini. The Master of Ceremonies doesn't decide, he executes. He doesn't speak, he directs. He doesn't improvise, he ensures the ritual is performed with precision. Agostini performed that role for more than 16 years, an exceptionally long period in an environment where changes in personnel are usually frequent. He served under 3 pontificates, adapting to different liturgical styles and sensibilities without becoming involved in conflicts or controversies. His long tenure is in itself an indicator of institutional trust and technical competence. In other words, he was a defender of the Latin Mass who kept his job, a very important one, under Pope Francis. To give you an idea that this is not a radical traditionalist, he may be traditionally minded, but he first took obedience to be his guide stone. He was never a political or media figure. Most people didn't know who he was. You only kind of knew about him if you really paid attention to personnel movements in the Vatican. But here's why he got in trouble. In recent years, Agostini became increasingly identified with the traditional liturgy. He frequently celebrated Mass according to the traditional Roman rite in the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica, a place where priests and faithful, particularly attentive to the classical form of the rite, gather. His participation in the traditional pilgrimage to Covadonga reinforced this identification. For many, Agostini represented a type of priest on the verge of extinction, well-trained, obedient, quiet, and liturgically traditional. And I would hazard a guess that he was one of the men key to keeping any kind of access to the traditional Mass at St. Peter's Basilica available. Because when Traditionis Custodes was implemented, it was banned in St. Peter's Basilica, except for the crypt, where about 10 or fewer people could attend the Mass. But he kept the presence of the traditional Mass there. And then he was kicked out after 16 years of service. And a lot of people began to ask the question, how did this happen? Now, there are some people in the chat pointing out also that this word that got him in trouble was also a word used by Pope Francis numerous times in various forms. My favorite quote of Pope Francis, and I wish that he had talked like this all the time, and that his actions reflected this, including his theology and the rest. He said, there are far too many liberals in the priesthood. And by liberals, I mean James Martin types. Pope Francis said that. If everything he did reflected that, Francis would have been probably the best pope of the post-conciliar era. But instead, it was Pope Francis. But you'll notice what is alleged to have been said by this priest isn't in conflict with that in the slightest. People asked, how did this happen? Well, turns out Celere non Possum was involved. Headline from Info Vaticana this morning: Perfetti, the Rainbow Vatican expert behind the attack on Agostini. Just a young, extremely progressive man, activist on James Martin topics. Take that to mean what you will. Note what he's wearing there. Catholic blogger. It all began with something that under normal circumstances would have been nothing more than an anecdote. During a public broadcast on Vatican News official channel, an ambient microphone picked up a confusing phrase. It was unclear who was speaking, who they were referring to, or whether it had any relevance. It could have been a private joke, a technician's comment, or a random remark of no consequence. Nothing that on its own would justify a scandal. And yet the scandal erupts, not after an investigation, but almost immediately, as if someone had been waiting for this very thing. Herein lies the first reasonable suspicion. Either someone deliberately microphoned Agostini, or someone requested that special attention be paid to the ambient microphones located near his position. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's simple logic. The audio wasn't discovered by chance a week later. It was detected instantly, and even the author of some whispers is identified, with someone waiting for this opportunity. And at this point, it is important to make this clear from the outset. The focus of the story isn't the audio recording, but rather those who are influencing the young Marco Filippo Perfetti, founder and director of Celere non Possum, a recently established church news outlet. He is 29 years old. He studied law in Bologna, but has ultimately gravitated towards journalism. He sports a sparse but meticulously trimmed beard and a rainbow bracelet. He is a militant advocate on social media for the James Martin agenda, both within and outside the church. He defends their marches and campaigns, labeling other Vatican experts as fearful and hateful of that group online. Proudly displays his symbols and has recently cultivated surprisingly close relationships with certain cardinals and curial officials. Certain conditions remain an advantage for accessing certain circles in Rome. Ironically, these are precisely the same circles that Agostini makes uncomfortable. When the audio surfaced, Perfetti didn't hesitate, didn't verify, and didn't ask questions. He uploaded the message. He published it, and he pushed it upwards Within hours, what was background noise became ammunition. The result was devastating. Agostini, with 16 years of impeccable service and having served under 3 pontificates, was summarily dismissed, not because of clear evidence, but because of a self-serving interpretation of a confusing audio recording. Zero mercy, zero prudence, maximum haste. And this is where many began to raise an eyebrow. Was this really so serious as to warrant such action, or was it simply the long-awaited moment to settle scores? Then comes the most revealing part. Perfetti and Celery Non Possum launched a social media campaign indiscriminately labeling traditionalists as repressed and hidden, frustrated James Martin types ourselves. That's what he's calling us. Even using a supposed anonymous interview with a cardinal friend of Perfetti. It's a reaction as exaggerated as it is childish, as noisy as it is revealing. There's a mockery, finger-pointing, and personal attacks. In other words, if you have a Catholic attitude about the sins that James Martin wants to normalize, then you yourself are a hidden away, repressed James Martin type yourself, self-loathing. It's silly. We've heard that attack many times. And he's making it here. The guy who is dressed like that, walking around proudly as a Catholic journalist in the Vatican. That is cause for public scandal. The kind of thing you have to make a public confession for. But no. It's the oldest tactic in the world among James Martin types, who, because of their position or role, feel challenged. They say that they may be of that type themselves, but so are you, and you're repressing it. Besides being petty, the strategy is ridiculous. For a defender of their program at the helm of a Catholic media outlet to try to discredit the traditional wing of the church by calling it James Martin type itself demonstrates more nervousness than strength. There's something neither Perfetti nor his allies can control, the reaction of the faithful. They can control the microphones, the media, and the offices. They may have the official church, but they lack the trust of ordinary people who perfectly distinguish between justice and settling scores. And that's what this is. Because, as we have seen, Agostini was a priest who defended the traditional faith quietly, likely behind the scenes, and is the man probably most directly responsible for the TLM being preserved in some way in the Vatican at a time when it was banned entirely. I'm very curious what you think about this. Do not be surprised by this at all. Thomas Joseph in the chat says the degenerates are in charge. That's the truth. That's the reason. Without question, unfortunately. Thank you for the super sticker. It is greatly appreciated. I want to have a story that's completely unrelated, but is related. Unfortunately, you see in the US and other places, your parish is being sold. Story as old as time. I mean, I've seen video footage from the 80s of people decrying the den of Chicago at the time to not consolidate and sell their parishes, and he did so. What he did with the money is anybody's guess. Probably just put it in the parish or the diocesan coffers, because at the time, the lawsuits that we're all so used to as the new normal hadn't really started yet. But I will tell you, they don't always do this in the most upfront way. Sometimes they act in bad faith. Sometimes they trick their own laity, their own parishioners, into supporting everything they need to do to sell the property for a higher value, for a higher profit. It's one of the most insidious, evil things you will see. Be wary of any diocesan-directed building projects in your diocese. And I hate to be that guy to tell you not to trust your bishop. If your bishop has a track record of being a staunch defender of the faith, being at least sympathetic to the traditional liturgy, if not, allowing it as much as he can, and actually speaking out on all the hot button issues, James Martin stuff these days, immigration, and doing it in defense of the church's actual teaching. The immigration issue is a more complicated topic than the U.S. bishops make it sound. If they have a good track record on this, then maybe trust them. But otherwise, you should look at anything with suspicion. And I hate to say that, but you got stories like this. This comes from Crisis Magazine. With this headline, when a bishop clearly acts in bad faith. Our bishop didn't just close and sell our church. he swindled parishioners into paying for what turned out to be capital improvements to make the sale more lucrative. In other words, the bishop in the story got the laity to pay for their own parish to be closed down. He got the priest to raise money through the laity, through second collections, to improve the building. And then he sold it, those improvements making the building much more valuable. That's evil. That is utterly evil. He took their parish from them. And he used their own treasure to facilitate the process. It's utterly amazing how brazen these guys can be. Here are the details. On October 3rd, 2023, the aforementioned bishop came to our relatively small church to celebrate the sacrament of confirmation for my twins and 30 other young believers from 2 other parishes. It was literally standing room only, and as always with confirmations, it was a moving ceremony. However, the following Sunday, our pastor, who was new to our parish and in his first term as a pastor at any parish, said that the bishop, during his brief visit to St. Raphael's, decreed that our church needed a paint job. Neither he nor the bishop were wrong. Our church, which already suffered from being designed as one of those post-Vatican II washing machine agitator floppy beach hat architectural disasters, had been painted a bright lime green. Our former pastor, who had spent 15 years at St. Raphael's and was beloved by all, especially for his being an excellent confessor and, let's keep this brief and to the point, homilist, has saved as much money as he could by not painting the interior. St. Raphael's, sadly, was ugly inside and out, but the bishop had spoken. It needed a fresh coat of paint. Our new and very young pastor quickly found a painter for the entire interior. It would cost each family $250, which in Niagara Falls dollars is a lot of money. This was in addition to the weekly tithes, insurance premiums, and the extra heating bill collection. In great news, the paint job was done quickly and very well. It was stunning, refreshing, and long overdue. But almost as soon as it was completed, rumors began that our church was on the chopping block to be shuttered, along with at least 2 other churches in Niagara Falls. In February of this year, 2025, Bishop Fisher said the final Mass at St. Raphael's. The building was sold to Baptists, or as no less an authority than St. Robert Bellarmine would call them, heretics. The problem here is obvious. It appears that to raise the value of the sale of St. Raphael's, Bishop Fisher wanted it painted, not unlike a New York City landlord who paints an apartment before raising the rent and putting it on the market. And he got his wish. Despite St. Raphael's being the last parish in Niagara Falls that the faithful could actually walk to, as well as being the only church in the north end of the city, it was summarily closed and sold. This, of course, shattered our pastor, who in a gut-wrenching and tear-jerking speech to us said he felt that he had failed us and misled us. While it is always somewhat reassuring to witness a priest show that he is indeed one of us, it was also heartbreaking. Please pray for that priest. We had all been hoodwinked. Bishop Fisher, who had absolutely no ties to any part of Western New York, indeed, his ecclesiastical career was based in Washington, D.C. under Cardinal Ted McCarrick and Cardinal Donald Wuerl, ground zero figures for the McCarrick problem. He had never reached past the Mason-Dixon line, had acted in bad faith. He took advantage of a young pastor's obedience and the people of St. Raphael's Parish by having us pay for a paint job he capriciously and arbitrarily ordered, only to close and sell the very same church he had visited exactly twice, once to confirm the faithful and complain to the pastor, and once to shut it down. The Diocese of Buffalo went bankrupt in 2020. That same year, our Christ the King Seminary, which had been rocked by its own in-house impurity scandal, was shuttered. Even the Vincentian Fathers, who run Niagara University and are age-old experts in turning around seminaries, were stymied. In a sense, these were portents of what was to happen throughout the rest of the diocese, closing churches under the guise of having to pay out a nearly endless stream of reparations for McCarrick offenses. All that to the side. I'm not sure how importing a bishop with no knowledge of Buffalo is supposed to fix a problem he cannot begin to understand. Well, this is not unique to Buffalo, unfortunately. We have been burdened by a bishop who acts more like a medieval monarch than a servant leader. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a story you should familiarize yourself with, because it's probably going to happen in a diocese near you at some point. He was appointed bishop last year. It means he was appointed by Pope Francis. But Cardinal Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV, was the Cardinal Archbishop and Prefect for the Dicastery of the Bishops, the office of the Vatican that makes the recommendations for new appointments to the bishops and transfers from one diocese to another of bishops. Get used to this. Those men, McCarrick and Worrell, were two of the biggest villains in the 2005 to 2018 period of the church. They were the men who took much of the blame, rightfully so, when Vigano dropped his testimony back in 2018, if you remember that. The thing that made Archbishop Vigano a household name in the church in America. And for good reason. Those men, well, McCarrick, at least, was an evil man. Don't know so much about Worrell, but his track record makes one think that he was at least very sympathetic to the Lavender cohort in the church in America, of which McCarrick was the king and kingmaker for key diocesan appointments in the church. And one of his proteges is now the bishop there in Niagara Falls. And he went to that parish after appointing a new priest, did his confirmation, did his job to confirm the faithful, part of a bishop's job, told them they needed to repaint it. They did so and immediately sold the parish. In the aftermath of the bankruptcies that came from the revelations in 2005. The gift that keeps on giving. Here we are 20 years later. We're not done with this yet. And there's no sign that we're going to be done with it 20 years from now. And with the kind of leadership the church has right now, there's no reason to believe that this will abate either. But I'm very curious what you think about this, so let me know in the comments. And please pray for everybody we spoke about negatively. I am not trying to make you angry at the Pope or any of these bishops. They do that job very well themselves. Let me know about any of these stories and in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does absolutely help. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. Please pray for the church. And, the current events going on in the secular world are starting to heat up a little bit. So pray for the leadership of the country and that all that sound decisions are made, that it conform to the will of God in the matter. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.